So let us begin. For the past 300 years, and especially since the Enlightenment, the West has evaluated the nature and value of other civilizations, such as China and Islam, solely in terms of the criterion of progress, and thus cast them in an ultimately negative light. In a time of deep crisis, in which the idea that we have progressed morally or socially seems to be undermined by everything we see around us, a new criterion should be especially welcome for the light it might shed on the reality of our current situation. In what follows, I want to invite you to consider both Islam and Western civilization through the lens not of progress, but of balance, mizan. When the West is viewed in these terms, the causes of many of our current crises come into sharp relief, and the true nature of Islamic civilization clarifies. There are three parts to the introduction of the book: narrative, crisis, and mizan, each of which I will briefly cover. There are 6 chapters which address the themes of sovereignty, civilization, knowledge, commerce, environment, and conquest. This evening I will be focusing on a particular aspect of the chapter on knowledge. The first part of the introduction deals with the narrative that we are proposing should be changed. The narrative of progress is deeply embedded in our consciousness. It informs our language and has moulded the way we think. Beginning in Europe during the Enlightenment, it is now the global narrative which powers the modern world. There is a sharp demarcation between positive words and those that carry a negative connotation. The narrative divides history into ancient, medieval, and modern periods. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe descended into a dark age which ended with the Renaissance. What's happened? Oh, sorry. Which ended with the Renaissance. This was followed by Reformation, Scientific Revolution, Enlightenment, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, through to the space age we now inhabit. Islam was provided with a role in the narrative of progress by being given a golden age during the Dark Ages, when it carried the torch of knowledge, which it then handed over to Europe. So in this arc of progress, whilst Europe ascended, Islam, after its moment of glory, declined and stagnated. Islamic nations now belong to a developing world that has to catch up with the developed world. The self-evident achievement of modernity is clearly expressed by the Australian economist Wolfgang Casper. Against the human experience of long-term stagnation and misery, the record of growing prosperity over the past 2 centuries, and in particular the last 50 years, is astounding. And this absolute conviction in the idea of human progress is shared across the globe. America's greatest strength has always been its hopeful vision of human progress. Changes call for innovation, and innovation leads to progress. And from our Prime Minister, her recent defence of capitalism, a free market economy operating under the right rules and regulations is the greatest agent of collective human progress ever created. It was a new combination which led societies out of darkness and stagnation into the light of the modern age. In the second part of the introduction, we address the tsunami of crises which now envelop us. Every day we are being warned by scientists of the multiple and escalating crises we face, and that we are heading for a perfect storm of global events that threaten our very existence. For example, only this morning the BBC reported that concentrations of key gases in the atmosphere that are driving up global temperatures reached a new high in 2017. In their annual greenhouse gas bulletin, the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, say there is no sign of reversal in this rising trend. We also examine the issues that are now undermining the very idea of human progress. From the dissolution after the terrible wars of the 20th century, through the impossibility of continuous growth, the awakening as to what actually took place during colonialism, the disintegration of the meta-narrative by Foucault, Derrida, Butler, and the other postmodernists, to the dystopic view of the future, vividly brought to life through a multitude of books and films. Then there is the chaos that has encompassed the world of Islam, such an outpouring of anger, cruelty, and horror in the name of Islam that is an outrage against everything that Islam represents. But it is the idea of the golden age of Islam, which, while appearing to be a compliment, is most damaging to the psyche of the Muslim, for it reduces Islam to a bit player in the narrative of progress. Finally, we address the Achilles heel of the theory of progress, the idea that modernity has rescued humanity from a past of darkness, stagnation, and misery. This could not be farther from the truth. And with the demolishing of this claim, the idea that modernity is creating a better world collapses. In the third part of our introduction, we invite the reader to view the past from another perspective, to see if it makes more sense. This is the first of several passages I will read from the book. Mizan is a universal principle. Everything is subject to it. If things are out of Mizan, sooner or later they fall apart. Human societies, cultures, and civilizations rise and fall according to the degree of their state of Mizan. In Arabic, the word Mizan can be translated as balance, justice, measure, harmony, or indeed weighing scales. It is an all-encompassing concept which contains the spiritual dimension that our secular understanding of balance does not convey. It is against this holistic criterion that our attempt to understand Islam and the West will be gauged. The primacy of Mizan is wonderfully captured in Surah Rahman. He raised the heavens and set up everything in Mizan, in balance, so that you would maintain Mizan, justice. Therefore maintain just measure and do not transgress against the Mizan, the balance. Throughout the following chapters, three fundamental examples of the Mizan will be woven into the fabric of the narrative as it unfolds. The first of this is the ontological Mizan. Before modernity, all civilizations believed in a sacred origin for their worlds, and in the Mizan that had to be maintained between the unseen, the human, and the material realms. Christianity and Islam shared an understanding of these realms. However, we will see that whilst Islam maintained the Mizan, with the collapse of Christendom leading to modernity's loss of knowledge and belief in the unseen, the Mizan was broken, with the inevitable consequences of the appearance of aberrations, multiple crises, and the inevitability of the collapse of the system. The second example is the vocational Mizan. The roles of scholar-priest, warrior-ruler, and merchant craftsman are archetypal, and the Mizan between them helps define the character of civilizations. We will see how in Islam the Mizan was established between the vocations and maintained through the process of dynamic equilibrium, creating a stable, sustainable, and universal civilization. A very different unfolding took place in the West. For 1,000 years, Christianity provided a spiritual culture that was extreme in its vertical aspiration and dominated by the priest. The Gothic cathedral is the perfect manifestation of this heavenly quest. With the Renaissance, the warrior hero replaced the saint at the apex of society. Humanism was born, and the monarch became absolute, with the classical palace replacing the Gothic cathedral. The Industrial Revolution and the French and American revolutions against the tyranny of monarchs and the fanaticism of the churches brought the merchant and craftsman into power. And the machine world we now inhabit was their creation. The West has proceeded from extreme spirituality through extreme humanism to the extreme materiality that now surrounds us. We will see how each vocation in the West created its own world, and how what we call the open plan brain of the modern contains all three worlds, somehow coexisting, but in a permanent state of conflict and contradiction. This trifurcation is very clear when illustrated. The saint of Christendom was followed by the warrior of civilization, and finally the merchant of the modern world. Each world had its own built environment, its own art, and its own educational system. From the book again. Lastly, we have the moral mizan of intellect, anger, and desire, which was formulated by Plato and adopted and developed by both Christianity and Islam. If intellect controls anger and desire, there is peace and harmony. If anger or desire control intellect, conflict and chaos ensue. This triad relates to the individual soul and is also mirrored in the vocational mizan. It has remained fundamental to Islam and Christianity as central to the disciplining of the soul. However, the reign of warrior ruler in the West unleashed a tsunami of violence and anger upon the world. And this was joined by the unfettering of desire with the ascendancy of the merchant craftsman, finally leading to the overturning of Christian morality. Also appearing within the fabric of the chapters are the binary mizans, heaven and earth, night and day, good and evil, inner and outer, male and female, rich and poor, and other pairs that encompass our existence. Whilst within Islam they remain crystal clear, we see how in the journey of the West to modernity they have become eroded. We now come to the chapter in the book dealing with knowledge. As with all the chapters, it sets the Islamic and West side by side. I would like to open with a paragraph from the book which spells out the fundamental difference between Islam and the West. At this point, it is important to understand the difference between the Islamic and modern understanding of what constitutes verifiable knowledge. For the modern mindset that traces its origins to the revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries, verifiable knowledge has been reduced to what can be discovered through the scientific method and is limited to the material realm. Everything else belongs to the imagination and is entirely subjective. In Islam, verifiable knowledge is understood to exist in all three realms of the unseen, human, and material, and through revelation and correct reasoning can be discovered. This is where Islam differed fundamentally from Christianity. In Christianity, faith came to require the setting aside of reason, whereas in Islam, the revelation was confirmed through reason. The Sinyan Mosque in the Turkish city of Edirne and the large Hadron Collider in Cern, Switzerland, represent two completely different ways of understanding the universe. The Hadron Collider, the largest in the world, is a ring 27 kilometers in circumference. Buried 100 meters underground, protons traveling at close to the speed of light produce tens of millions of collisions every second. These collisions are supposed to recreate the conditions of the first moments of the universe, so that scientists can discover what the universe is made of and how it got started. The Edirne Mosque was built by the great Ottoman architect Sinan between 1569 and 1575. This glorious building brings heaven down to earth through a series of domes and half-domes that cascade out of the great central dome, while the four minarets stand sentinel, pointing back towards the heavens, calling the faithful to prayer. The worshipper enters an awesome space that achieves the mizan between the vertical and horizontal, the heavens and the earth, where all tension is resolved and peace is manifested. In the heart of the great dome is Surah Ikhlas from the Holy Quran, attesting the oneness of God. The building is a perfect manifestation of the Holy Quran. The power of the revelation was so great that whilst the craftsman realized the Holy Quran in material form, it fully engaged and fulfilled the intellectual life of generations of scholars who could never exhaust the possibility it contains. What they were seeking was its meaning. And the same approach was applied to the universe, which was also understood in terms of revelation. Whereas the modern scientist seeks to understand how it came into being and what it is made of, the Muslim seeks to understand its message and its meaning. We will show them our signs on the horizon and in themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. The golden age of Islam is the 23 years of prophecy and revelation. The next segment from the book describes what happened when the prophetic age came to an end and the scholars were left to fend for themselves. An immense intellectual ferment took place as the rational mind grappled with the revelation. All shades of possible approach were expressed. The main tendencies were represented by the Hashbiyah, fideist literalists, who remained with the face value of the text, the Mutazilites, rationalists, who imposed their rationalist interpretations on revelation, and esoterists who prioritized the inner or symbolic interpretation of the Quran, and even dispensed with the importance of its literal meaning. The remarkable achievement of the philosophers and theologians in the later period was to find the synthesis in which the four fundamental sources of knowledge, revelation, mystical cognition, reason, and sensation, were brought into a state of mizan, and the unity at the heart of Islam unveiled. This journey of discovery took 500 years and the contribution of many great scholars. Foremost among whom were Ibn Sina, who transformed philosophy and developed a universal science of metaphysics that could encompass all of the sciences and simultaneously attain the heights necessary for an adequate intellectual treatment of revelation. Imam al-Ghazali, whose monumental work recognized the mystic path as reaching the highest knowledge of God attainable within a framework that acknowledged the value and relationality of every field of human knowledge. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, who by applying his epoch-making intellectual power to a synthesis of Avicennan general metaphysics and the revelatory principles of Kalam theology, created a new all-encompassing Kalam, in which all knowledge was shown to be part of a single truth, and paved the way for the great summas of the 14th and 15th centuries. And Ibn Arabi, known forever as the greatest master, who for the first time fully encompassed philosophy within his mystical vision, and thus contracted a sublime marriage between them. By the 15th century, a synthesis of Akbarian, Avicennan, and Razian thought was complete, powerfully exemplified in the works of thinkers like Mullah Fanari and Tashko Pruzadeh in the Ottoman world. And a hierarchy of knowledge had been established that took in the revealed sciences alongside all of the branches of philosophy and mysticism. This hierarchy would come to be adopted in the higher educational structures of both the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire in India. In this hierarchy of knowledge, those sciences pertaining to the knowledge of God the spiritual and the metaphysical were the highest, and those relating to the corporeal, the limited, and the material, the lowest. Everything had its place, and when it was in its rightful position, the mizan was achieved. When looking at Islam, the Enlightenment in Europe saw only its achievement in the material sciences. However, in Islam, the material sciences did not take off on their own as they did in the West. Rather, they formed part of a whole. Engagement with the physical world was kept within bounds and was there to support a holistic way of life. At the time the synthesis was taking place in Islam, Western Christendom was in turmoil and being torn apart. The book takes up the story. However, there lay at the heart of this schism a profound theological problem within Christianity: the relationship between faith and reason. The problem did not arise until a higher understanding of logic, philosophy, and metaphysics was introduced through the works of Ibn Sina. Aquinas, in his Summa Theologia, attempted to reconcile faith and reason, but was unable to do so. He had to recognize their separation within Christianity. Fundamental contradictions appeared when approaching the Incarnation and the Trinity. The Catholics made the best of keeping reason within the domain of the sacred. However, the Protestants, believing faith to be the only way of approaching the deity, abandoned reason to the secular realm, with devastating consequences. The material realm became the only field with which reason could engage. It had no place in religion. The natural philosopher arose and in time would mutate into the modern scientist, who would eventually lay claim to all verifiable knowledge concerning our existence. Aquinas could not produce the synthesis. Revelation and mystical cognition were banished from the domain of verifiable knowledge, which left the field to rationalism and empiricism, with the only subject, the material universe, divorced from its spiritual moorings, leading to a world dominated by the machine. Sir Francis Bacon: my only earthly wish is to stretch the deplorably narrow limits of man's dominion over the universe to their promised bounds. Nature will be bound into service, hounded in her wanderings, and put on the rack and tortured for her secrets. For Descartes, the soul is imprisoned within itself and radically disconnected from a physical world that is purely quantitative and mechanistic in operation. The Cartesian vision of man in the world has thus been famously described as one of the ghost in a machine. The mathematical precision of his account of the universe led to the invocation of his theories to support a range of mechanistic views widely popular at the time and subsequently. This depicted the world as a great machine that is essentially self-sufficient, a clockwork universe. The whole can contain the part, but the part cannot contain the whole. This is a fundamental truth, and is an essential dimension of Mizan. We are now experiencing the consequences when the mereological principle is breached, and the part claims to be the whole, destroying the Mizan, and producing the unintended consequences that surround us, a selection of which follow. Thomas Newcomen was an ironmonger by trade and a Baptist lay preacher by calling. He invented the first coal-fired steam engine to solve the problem of removing water from deep mines. He had no idea that the consequences of releasing the fossil fuels from under the earth and seas would be global warming and the possible destruction of life on Earth. Albert Einstein solved an equation that had been eluding mathematicians for decades and was celebrated for it. He had no idea that it was one of the critical steps that would lead to the atom bomb. If only I had known, I should have become a watchmaker. And he was devastated. DDT was hailed as a miracle product in the 1940s and 50s, and its inventor, Paul Hermann Muller, received the Nobel Prize in 1949. In 1962, Silent Spring was published, and within 6 months, 500,000 copies were sold. It revealed the devastating destruction of nature and the threat to human health that DDT posed. Rachel Carson was vilified by the scientific community. Miss Carson claims that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature. The book was the catalyst that set in motion the environmental movement. It was of a huge importance. I don't know whether any of you have read it, but it was in the 60s. It was absolutely the opening of a whole new time period. Warwick, we've got him. Thomas Midgley. Thomas Midgley. Has anybody heard of Thomas Midgley? Thomas Midgley was a highly decorated mechanical engineer working for General Motors in the 1920s and 30s. He made 2 innovations. To solve the knocking in car engines, he added lead to petrol. For 80 years, all over the world, lead was spewed out into the environment with devastating effects, which are still with us. His second invention was CFCs, as a coolant in fridges. The consequences of this was to create a hole in the ozone layer. Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. J.R. McNeill, environmental historian. Well, it was kind of an accident, because plastic is not what I meant to invent. Some accident. Plastics have contaminated the oceans, the rivers, the waters we drink, and the air we breathe. It is only now that we are beginning to understand the impact plastics are having on our health and the planet's. Norman Borlaug was the mastermind behind the so-called Green Revolution that has been more aptly named the Chemical Revolution by the Indian scientist Vandana Shiva. To produce super yields, the land has been poisoned, the water sucked out of the earth, and the traditional farming practices, knowledge and sources destroyed. In India, some 400,000 farmers have committed suicide in the last 10 years, mostly caused by the chemical system plunges them into debt. Brazil's Cerrado savanna, the size of Western Europe and one of the richest ecosystems on the planet, is being destroyed at the rate of 1 million hectares a year to grow soya beans for animal feed. The local farmers are being driven off the land, their houses burnt, their livestock killed, and their livelihoods destroyed. My message to people is this: everything that is sent abroad cheaply is paid for by somebody's suffering. Alexander Fleming invented penicillin, a miracle addition to the armory of the war against bugs. In the modern environment of factory farming, people crowding, and global travel, the bugs fought back and mutated. Now we have a super problem. Superbugs will kill us before climate change does. Dame Sally Davis, Chief Medical Officer for England. Research scientists at Cambridge University and other leading institutions around the world are engaged in 2 major activities. Either, like the British Antarctic Survey, they are dealing with the problems caused by the unintended consequences of the past, or they are going deeper and deeper into matter, like the Nanoscience Centre, producing the next generation of unintended consequences, which are likely to be even more serious. The deeper you go into matter, the more dangerous the forces that are released. In The Master and His Emissary, Ian McGilchrist, a neuroscientist, posits that the modern world is the product of the left hemisphere of the brain, which is unable alone to see things in context. It needs to be working with the right hemisphere to have a complete picture. Rationality, divorced from its holistic context, appears to belong in the left hemisphere. This is an amazing book. I don't know whether you've read it, anybody's read it, but everyone should read this book. It's a great work by a very fine scientist most of his work has come from clinical work, the study of the brain in terms of illness and disease. Nothing, however, demonstrates our perilous situation more than what is taking place in the science of artificial intelligence. Here we have the perfect scenario of man divorced from God, playing God. In the 19th century, the idea that the scientist could create a living creature that would turn against his creator was terrifying. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's monster embodied the nightmare. The cinema took up the theme, and the mad scientist joined the repertoire as both a comedic and terrifying figure. However, the scientists are now taking us into a far more dangerous and sinister world. They are creating a monster that makes Frankenstein's look pretty harmless. After all, he could be dealt with. Just listen to the promoters of this insanity. AI is developing fast, no longer just relying on programmers telling it the rules. It's learning to do amazing things by itself, faster and sometimes even better than we can. What's more, it started to discover ways of doing things we didn't know about. Now, I don't believe there's any pixie dust that we have to sprinkle over the grey matter in our heads to bring about consciousness. There's nothing our brains do that couldn't, in principle, be replicated. I feel inspired by what AI can already do today, and I believe that through AI we'll greatly extend our own capacities, changing our lives in ways we can't yet imagine. Professor Jim Al-Khalili. They will go inside our brains. They'll connect our brains to the cloud, not just to do things like search and translate, but to actually extend the power of our thinking and give us more neocortical modules and more hierarchy to our neocortex, which will make us smarter and enable us to create more profound music, to be funnier, to be more artistic, to basically enhance those qualities of humanity that we value. Well, this is their first attempt. This is the first step in AI creativity. A painting recently auctioned for £432,500. When I first saw this picture, I thought it was supposed to be a joke. But the AI fanatics are deadly serious. They believe the next stage in evolution is the cyborg. Fortunately, there are many scientists who have not lost their minds and are worried. With artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demons. Elon Musk. I don't understand why some people are not concerned. Bill Gates. Artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. Stephen Hawking. The insanity that now inhabits the scientific community brings into question the extraordinary theories that scientists are positing regarding the universe. How certain is the idea that our universe is 95% made of dark matter and energy? The Cambridge particle physicist Harry Cliff, in his lecture at the Royal Society, brilliantly demonstrated the fragility of this and many other theories. When you hear the word dark in physics, you should get very suspicious. Basically, it means we don't know what we are talking about. In a documentary film made shortly before his death, Stephen Hawking was asked the question, in physics, there are these two huge theories, Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. The holy grail for some time has been how we can draw these two together. It's what people refer to as a theory of everything. Do you think we will ever achieve that? Stephen Hawking answered, I think we will eventually discover a unified theory, though it may take longer than the 20 years I predicted 40 years ago. There is a very simple reason why a theory of everything eludes the scientists. It is because the idea of a single harmonious truth of the subsuming of particular theoretical models within a large theory of greater generality that is nonetheless true is a relic from a metaphysics that the contemporary physical sciences unknowingly continue to aspire to, although they are entirely ignorant of its origin in religion. A unified theory that genuinely works will never be discovered in physics. There can be no theory of everything for the physicalist because there are many more non-physical things in heaven and earth, including unified theories that can be dreamt of in their philosophy. In Islam, however, all of the sciences existed within a framework of unity, harmony, and mutual interdependence, crowned by metaphysics and theology. In this scheme of subalternation, all the special sciences, such as physics, assumed all of their principles, which were accepted on faith as postulates, and could only be proved genuine principles within metaphysics. The sciences were there exactly to produce a genuine theory of everything, crowned by revelation. A perfect synthesis, producing sublime intelligence, leading to the mind at peace. Humanity, God's vicegerent on earth, receptive to the luminosity of revelation, with the faculties of spirit, mind, and senses, fully alive and in a state of mizan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much all for this wonderful, thought-provoking and really fundamentally challenging talk that really encourages us and invites us to think some of the most basic fundamental ways of making sense of the world. Please, Hassan.
Can you get another chair? Take another chair.
Yeah. No, I'll get one here. So, maybe Paul, can you make a word of introduction?
Yes. Hassan Spiker is the person who's contributed so much to this particular chapter. And where you found me stumbling a little bit were definitely passages which he had contributed. But for me it's like living with well, I'm much older than he is, but in other ways the relationship is very much the other way around.
We can receive questions?
Of course.
Yes? So please. Yes, please.
So you said something about the theoretical problem in Christianity being the relationship between faith and reason. Could you please elaborate on that?
Sorry, can you just say it again?
You said the theoretical problem in Christianity
Yes.
is the relationship between faith and reason.
Yes.
Could you please elaborate on that and possibly give examples?
Well, I think, would you like to say a little bit about that?
Sure. But let me first of all thank Paul for his wonderful talk, and obviously the last thing he said was, I don't think in the slightest true, because, you know, the broad principles of his re-evaluation of Western civilization and the supposedly bit part played by Islam in terms of this principle of mizan has really illuminated my own thinking. I was traditionally trained in logic and philosophy by traditional teachers in the Middle East for just over a decade, and recently returned. But it's been a wonderful thing having my thinking be informed by Paul. In terms of faith and reason, did you say being a theoretical problem?
That was what he said.
That's what he said.
I think.
It's a very broad question. Obviously, Christianity faced a very different situation to Islam just because the tenets of faith in Christianity simply are fundamentally different in certain important ways. Scholars in the last century found somewhat to the, I wouldn't say embarrassment of certain Dominican scholars, but they found that a great deal more than they'd thought of Aquinas came directly from Ibn Sina, and in fact much of it was in the form of paraphrase. So a lot of texts that we thought were coming from Aquinas were actually directly lifted from Ibn Sina. That's not to say that, that was both in the medieval world and in the Islamic world, that was quite ordinary. It wasn't plagiarism or anything. This was knowledge, and you would just, tell it how it is in the best way possible. And of course there's a huge amount which is very original in Aquinas. But basically what you have with Ibn Sina is the introduction of demonstrative science into the Christian world. So the idea of burhan, which means demonstrative science, rather than jadal, which is dialectic. And so that's one of the fundamental differences between Plato and Aristotle as well, is that Aristotle considered Plato's thought to be fundamentally dialectical. It doesn't start from first principles and the application of logic to first principles, and doesn't arrive at conclusions which are truly scientific. They're merely persuasive, so the Socratic dialogues and so on. But Ibn Sina formulated, he's often seen by scholars today as being the most important, the most influential thinker on the Islamic world and the West after Aristotle. And he formulated very, very powerful universal science, in Arabic al-ilm al-kulli, or demonstrative metaphysics, which when it was introduced to the West, really shook the way, in the broadest terms, that Western philosophers looked at the doctrines of the Incarnation and the Trinity. So at the time of things like Anselm and others, there's an idea that it's actually possible to prove the Incarnation and the Trinity true, because, and this is something very common to the so-called Dark Ages in general, is an idea that you can. I've just realised I'm giving a speech, and I'm supposed to be answering a very small question, so I'll try and compress it a bit more. But this is actually directly related to a particular article that I've written on this exact topic. So the general idea was that anything which is necessary, God is necessary, and therefore something which necessarily belongs to his nature, i.e. being a Trinity and having become incarnate, must be also necessarily demonstrable. You must be able to show that. Augustine would say that's because we have an imprint of there is an imprint of the Trinity in the created world, and we're able to somehow see it. But that was he never said that it must be demonstrable, but later thinkers in the so-called Dark Ages, it was a very, very strong theme that there's a fundamental unity between the items of Christian creed and reason, and the great principle expressing that was that we believe in order to understand, and so there's this natural relationship between the act of belief and then being able to rationally understand everything. This was hugely. When we get to Aquinas in the introduction of the notion of demonstrative science, it became very clear very quickly that it's impossible to demonstrate these things. And the doctrine of the Incarnation of the Trinity is something that you simply can't, that it suggests a split between reason and faith. When you really put those arguments under scrutiny, you find that they don't make any sense unless you already will to believe in the Trinity and the Incarnation. And so this, more than anything else, was suggestive of a fundamental split in the West between faith and reason, which was later taken up by Luther, simply because, and then, Aquinas tried to say that the Trinity and the Incarnation cannot be proven demonstratively, but they're at least not contradictory. So he made a kind of neat split between faith and reason. That reason can support the creed in many important ways, but there are certain issues like the Trinity and Incarnation where they become holy mysteries which we simply can't deal with the rational mind because they're such elevated things. And so there was a clear difference between that which is knowable by the rational mind and that which is not knowable by the rational mind. This was further cemented by Luther, who was actively opposed to reason. Luther, of course, was an Occamist philosopher. He was a highly trained Occamist philosopher, and Occam himself rejected Aquinas' synthesis because he said it's not the case that the Trinity and Incarnation simply can't be proved by reason. They're actually in themselves contradictory. They actually oppose reason actively. And so we just have to see these violations of the principle of non-contradiction as just being anomalies, and then faith takes center stage, because if the most important truths about God seem to be opposed to reason, it would seem that there's something wrong with reason. You would have to say, well, in that case we must suspect reason. So that's the short answer to...
So with Luther, the split was complete. So reason becomes divorced from religion. And we see the consequences around us.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Dr. Keeler. It's a really interesting kind of view into the narrative about Islam. In terms of the kind of overall goal, question one about theory, that's sort of my theory of this narrative. Is it to correct the Western perspective on Islam, or is it to develop an Islamic perspective on the narrative? Because...
Sorry, could you start again?
Sorry. So in terms of this changing the narrative, is it to correct the Western narrative on Islam, or is it to develop an organically Islamic narrative of itself? Because, again, I think in terms of sort of things that you've been talking about finding the mizan, finding balance, I sort of heard sort of kind of reminiscences recently, sort of Sachs Murata's work about the Tao of Islam, looking at Islam from a Chinese perspective, Chinese philosophical perspective, that actually, in some ways, brings out these kind of intrinsic principles within the Islamic discourse.
Very interesting. Is that it?
Well, that was so. Is it to correct it?
Yes, yes.
Or is it to...
What I think one has to grapple with is the fact that mizan is a universal principle. It's fundamental to everything. It's fundamental in nature, it's fundamental in everything we do, we engage with. If we don't eat properly, if our body is not being looked after properly and it's not in a state of balance, we're in trouble. Disease starts to come, the rest of it. So what is very interesting is, in fact, the relationship of Islam in China, because China has a very powerful understanding of mizan. And there was a very close connection between Islam and there wasn't in terms of doctrine, it was a comfortable relationship, not like with the West. So when we say changing the narrative, you can only ride one horse. You can't ride two horses. If you look at the world from the point of view of Mizan, then what we are now encountering at this particular moment in time is insanity. It is the biggest breach of Mizan imaginable. Nature is screaming at us now. And your generation is a generation where the whole thing is coming to a climax. I'm the generation that saw the beginning of the point where people started to become uncomfortable about it. In the 60s, it was amazing. But now, everybody's uncomfortable. And for a very good reason. So, the breaking, you see in something, the way that the whole of the story has been told, is that the West got it right, and it's the triumph, and everybody else got left behind. And then this idea of progress has actually taken everyone into it. Every culture, every civilization is brought into this concept of progress. And it's become a universal idea. And the importance of the Mizan is that unless we stand at a point where one is outside of that ideology, that thesis, we can never see it for what it is. It's impossible.
If I can respond, ask a further question, which is, so we're really developing a full narrative. We're developing a full kind of holistic narrative on history. Does this mean that we then have to, for example, adopt Abdul Sabra's modernity thesis, saying actually the relationship between, in terms of philosophy, theology, and so on, that the West is one that's much more organic, much more receptive, and less from the current receptive, which is Western.
I think that the most important thing is actually the discovery of what actually happened in Islam. Because for 1,000 years, Islamic civilization did something extraordinary, in that it produced a universal world. Its claim of universality is very powerful, because from West Africa right through to China, you had this civilization. Now, the problem is that we're living in a time of trauma, when all civilizations other than the modern have been traumatized, either completely destroyed or eliminated, or traumatized to an extent that they're living traumas. I mean, with the Muslim world, it's very much that the intellectuals are going around saying, what happened? How did we get left behind? How did we, the religious, it's a matter of, it must have been our fault. Mea culpa, we did something wrong, we didn't worship God, we were, etc. Something happened. But actually what happened was a power was released that could not be opposed. It simply couldn't. There was no way in which the power that when in Europe the power was released of this new kind of force, material force, more material power, nothing could resist it. We're now living in the point of crisis where in fact that power is on the wane. It's in trouble. Anywhere you look, I mean, a beautiful way of looking at it in terms of the financial world. The only thing that keeps this whole system moving is growth. It's like it's like cancer is a wonderful metaphor for this. And that growth now is entirely produced through debt. That if you think about it, generations have been put into debt in order to keep this system going. And that's the financial one. And that's something that scares the life out of people. And when we had the 2008 crisis, it was very frightening. The whole system could have collapsed at that moment. And at any time the system could collapse. So we're living at this time of multiple crises. And in order to see it, one has to be outside of it. You can't be outside of it in terms of, the power it has over you. It demands your service. You can't live outside of it. But the height of madness is when a man is in a prison and he doesn't know he's in a prison. He thinks he's in a paradise land. That's the height of madness. Yes?
I'm curious, why do you end your narrative of Christianity with Lutheranism? That's not where it ends. And you have Calvinism, you have progress in different ways of thinking and reasoning, and a lot of the development of the Western world, when it comes to law, when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, took place in England, not in other countries, largely because there was a rule of law. Everyone knew the science. It was because of the ability to trust through various mechanisms that we had this progress. Calvinism is a philosophical way of looking at Christianity differently than Lutheranism. So, to a certain extent, there is mizan in Calvinism and in some of the other ideas in Christianity. So, I'm just curious why there's this limited way in which you propose that there's a new era, when in fact you didn't fully explain the rest.
No, I mean, obviously, in the limits of a lecture like this, one can't continue right through everything. But the importance of Luther is huge, because after Luther, you have the next, if you could say, almost the most influential thinker, Kant, who's a Lutheran. And you've got this whole thing. So what we're interested in is not the fact that certain sects could create some sort of an accommodation in this new world that we're talking about, but to understand the nature of how reason, which is only one of the faculties which allow us to comprehend, it's only one of the faculties, how reason was taken out of that synthesis and became isolated and alone, and the world that created, because this is the critical thing. Christianity then becomes a sideshow. Christianity in the modern world is a sideshow. It's a part, the modern way of life is divided between work and leisure. And Christianity is a private matter. Religion is a private matter for your private pleasure, your life, your private life. It's nothing to do. It doesn't form the society any longer. The modern world is, to imagine the difference between the medieval Christendom of 1,000 years, 1,000 years of Christendom, and then you look at modernity, there's nothing that connects them. They are disconnected from each other. You go to New York or you go into any modern city where you've got the skyscrapers and you've got the modern way of life and you've got the modern ethics and you've got the modern morality. Everything that's going on today about gender and all the rest of it. This is completely contrary to the whole Christian structure, the whole Christian world. So the reason why we talk about Luther is that Luther was a big figure. Luther tore the whole temple down. Occam and the others were on the way towards that after Aquinas. But it was Luther who really nailed the thing onto the door of the thing and completely ripped the Christendom apart. And after that was the end of Christendom. There was no longer a universal Christian world.
It wasn't Paulian, but it was his contribution of sola scriptura is the main contribution, and he gave rise, he liberated the individual, and to the extent that the individual has the capability to reason, he made it possible. So I wouldn't exactly say that it's the end of Christendom.
Yes, but again, you see, you're talking about reason, making reason possible. You're giving the narrative. You're giving the narrative of progress. You've already been talking about progress. You are defending the narrative of progress. I'm saying that the narrative of progress has led us, because it's a very new thing. It's something that is very foreign to any other world. The narrative of progress has led us to a crisis which these young people, I don't know what your age is, but you're probably closer to me than you are to them. And these young people are the ones that are going to have to handle it. And if they don't know what it is, if they don't know what this thing is, then God help them. Because one of the things it's eating into is people's faith in God. That is one of the things it's eroding. And that is where in the Muslim world you have this problem. And that's why it is so important to understand that Islam actually succeeded. It actually succeeded in its quest to know God and to live according to the way of God. And in that process of success, reason played a very vital role. The minute you take reason out of its group, out of the participation of the other faculties of knowing, you've got a very, very dangerous faculty. And this is where we come again to this whole mereological principle of the whole can contain the part, but the minute the part actually claims the whole, you've got trouble. And one of the ways you can see this is that in Islam, after the prophetic period, each of the parts, the reason, mystical cognition, the sensing, all the different ways of seeing, understanding, were actually claiming the whole. That's why you've got the Mu'tazilites saying, we are right. The miracle of Islam is the way in which the direction was always towards understanding, unity, the theory of everything, how everything comes together. And so all of these faculties and the scholars, step by step, came to that synthesis. And when they arrived at that synthesis, there was mizan. And there was peace in the mind and in the heart and in the whole social order. That was the achievement. It happened. It actually worked. But because we have been looking at it through a completely different lens, we can't see it. We can't see it. And at this particular moment, that understanding of the mizan, which again, beautiful thing of Rachel Carson. When Rachel Carson came up against the scientists, who all said, we are controlling nature. We're doing well. Look at this. We're getting rid of the bugs. We're getting rid of all this stuff. And she said, you have to work with nature. We are a part of nature. And that was the beginning of the whole environmental ecological movement. That woman who, 18 months after the book was published, she died of cancer. She was a remarkable woman. But she saw it. She recognized that we were a part of nature. And the minute we stepped out and we said, we are the controllers, we are God. And I must emphasize, look into the question of what is going on with this artificial intelligence. It is the most stupid thing ever to reduce the human being. The idea that you can replicate the human, this great mystery, this extraordinary being that has this huge faculties of understanding, of beauty, of truth, and reduce it to a kind of rationality, a kind of mathematical equation, and think that you're actually doing something that is actually evolving humanity. And the most dangerous thing is exactly what was understood in the 19th century by the poets, by Mary Shelley when she produced her amazing book, Frankenstein's Monster, was that we are actually creating something that, because we have taken one aspect, which is the only thing we can replicate, the one aspect from this huge creature that is the human, and we're taking that out of its context and developing it. And already it actually escaped from us. That is very frightening. So when we talk together, you will present to me the progress thesis and defend it. I'm not prepared to accept that. I think the evidence now has gone the other way. All the universities now are full of Foucault and Derrida, did I get that right? And Butler, and all these revolutionaries who have torn down the meta-narrative of progress. They've torn it down. And the universities are full of their thought. And they have said some brilliant things, because it's very easy to criticize something. Marx did it brilliantly. But to have the solution is another thing altogether. And these people have, with their brilliant minds, they've literally completely taken it apart. What are they left in its wake? Nothing.
We have maybe one more question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have two questions. Would that be okay? Or is that
No, go ahead.
Thank you. So just a very quick comment first. Thank you so much for the presentations, and I think that my comment is that I think it's evidently a presentation coming from people who are a person or persons who are not just scholars of Islam, but also Islamic scholars, very explicitly and evidently. So I think that's a bit of a rarity in westernized universities, and I think it's wonderful that the Center for Islamic Studies has organized this talk, and I'd love to see more of the same. So my two questions are related to, the first is about language, and the second is about time. So in your talk, you framed it around the concept of mizan, and I was struck by how you did not translate that, and you're using this term, and despite you speaking in English, a term coming from Arabic. And I wonder what your thoughts behind this, whether you think that it is something that can be or should be translated, or whether you think it's important to keep these concepts in the Arabic that you're using. And of course, looking behind my question, you will find the work of Toshiko Ezutsu or Naqib al-Attas, and there what the Islamic philosophy of language, where Arabic is very important. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And the second question is related to, in this concept of mizan, it's obvious that you're not just trying to change a theory of history where Islam has a certain role in the progress towards the Renaissance and Enlightenment, but in fact, mizan for me, it seems like you're trying to present, ensconce within mizan, a different concept of time itself, not a linear, evolutionary, teleological concept. But I'll be curious to see what exactly if you have any thoughts on this, and how then the discipline of history, for instance, would look differently under the edges of such a concept.
If I could just say the first part, we've thought a great deal about this, but there are many words which actually do come into English. Islam was one. I mean, jihad, Sharia. These terms, obviously, all the time, the languages are adopting terms from other. But we thought a lot about this because, but in the end, as I said in the paper, the reason we've been using mizan is because balance doesn't. Balance is brilliant, but it doesn't provide that fullness. And also, we need, in a sense, to take people out and look at something from a different perspective. And mizan is it's a device in the sense that if you take our time, it's a valuable. There are many possible criteria, obviously, that one could use. But at this particular moment in time, humanity is so aware of the fact that we're out of balance. We're out of balance with nature. There's so many things in which the balance is a problem. So this is not something that is difficult for people to comprehend. And it is you could say that it is the fundamental question that, once you're out of balance, then you're in big problems. And that's why the other thesis that the other term that we're using a lot in our work is dynamic equilibrium. Because, of course, that's the way that balance is maintained, through dynamic equilibrium. It's a dynamic process to maintain the balance. So I'm hoping that mizan will become a familiar term, because I think it brings into the language a whole dimension, particularly the spiritual dimension, that balance no longer has. Your second question sounds like a very big one, and I would love you just to sort of try and tell me again so that I might understand it.
So your critique of progress also is a critique of a notion of time where we're progressing through stages of history towards something, and where things like Islam have a role. And therefore, when you're introducing mizan, I'm wondering how does this also present us with an understanding of time? Like, does history progress teleologically, evolutionary through particular stages, or does it have, a cyclical conception of time? Or is there anything that you can comment on time in mizan?
I think, again, we've been, the whole concept of progress and evolution has produced a whole historical approach. It has basically placed everything on the horizontal. And in order to, and of course it's very different from the Christian comprehension of time and history. It's also, interestingly, that the sort of the Renaissance, the rebirth, was a moment when you were actually looking back and idealizing a dead world, which had been dead for thousands. That's chapter 2 in my book. It was the idealization of a dead world. So this was an extraordinary thing that happened, and it's very important in terms of the relationship of the detachment that then took place, and the aboutness, the fact that you started to look, you started to study about things. You were no longer being made into something. So the whole educational structure changed. But in terms of the mizan, I think every world, it seems to me Spengler actually had, had a lot of sense in some respects. In the sense that the two versions of history, one was that the different civilizations each have a rise and a fall. I find that much more convincing, because each world is so unique, and the idea that we can penetrate other worlds without being in them is an extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary idea when you think about it. And it's one of the things which I've experienced in my own life, because I was born, and I was born in 1942, and I was the last generation that was educated for empire. So I don't know whether any of you ever saw that film, that wonderful film, The Four Feathers. You ever see the Four Feathers? Oh, you didn't? Yeah. Well, you know what the British Empire was, the culture. I lived it. I spent 10 years being educated to become an operative within the British Empire. And then I left school in 1916, there wasn't any empire, so I was out of a job. So basically, but that experience, because then during the 60s, I rebelled, as a lot of people did. I rebelled. I tore down what was there before, But the being inside something and looking at it from the outside is two completely different things. And then I had the changeover becoming inside Islam. And it's an extraordinary thing. So I believe in terms of the nature of worlds, that worlds rise and fall, like families, like dynasties, like everything, they rise and fall. They have a life cycle. The mystery, there are too many mysteries that cannot be penetrated by the human mind. For me, anyway. There's too many mysteries. To try to create, from the Big Bang through to now, and fit everything into that narrative, it makes an absurdity of everything. It turns everything. Big history is the new thing. The idea from the Big Bang through to today. It makes a nonsense of all these different things. Complete nonsense. The whole idea of the history of art. Oh, for heaven's sake. You take modern art, you take the art of the Renaissance, the civilized Greco, then you take the medieval art. What history does that tell you? They're different, they're completely different worlds. I know about this because I had an art gallery with modern art for 3 or 4 years in the 60s. I got really involved in it. I was convinced. So this is the problem. So I think, this whole idea of this historical, creating this great thing, you see where it's very difficult because the investment in the modern world is huge. You're sitting in an institution, which has a vast investment in this thing. And the idea that this could actually all come to an end is very difficult to take into account. But look at it. You are being told every day by some scientific experts. The people who created the problem are now telling you there's a big problem in every aspect. So all these aspects, everything is up for question. But the difference is that whereas Foucault is tearing everything apart, if you are a Muslim and you're in the position of Mizan, which I'm not saying I am, I'm just saying that one can understand. I'm just like anybody just trying to look at it. But you are in a position where you can actually comprehend and actually act in the manner that one has to act at this great time of crisis. Because the crisis is writ large. In the 1960s, it wasn't so obvious. The modern world was looking pretty flashy then, I can tell you. I remember going to the Festival of Britain, it looked very flashy. That thing, I forget what it's called. It was Skylon. The Skylon. Completely meaningless. Utterly, it didn't have an iota of meaning in it. God, we were all looking at it, amazing. But now, not now. You can't do it when everybody's telling you from every area of this university, they're telling you that we're in trouble. The problem is that the modern mind is a fragmented mind. It's an open plan brain. It's learnt to live with contradictions. So it can't see how things connect up. So it cannot see the nature of the picture. That's where the mizan comes in.
Well, I think we have to bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Paul, for this very, very thought-provoking, not only thought-provoking, but disturbing, but also encouraging us to rethink some fundamentals. And I couldn't think of a better way to bring the series for this term to a close. So, before asking you to join me in thanking Paul for his wonderful talk, I want to encourage you to look at our website and to look up and expect a series of talks to continue next 2 terms. We have, as I keep on reminding you, a talk every other Thursday. So please check our website, and also before we bring this term to a close, I would like to thank Neil and Ludmilla very much for all the effort and assistance that they have been giving us, and for a very seamless effort you've been putting in running the center. And now I want to ask you to join me in thanking Paul very much. Thank you.